Verity Research did an analysis of Sri Lanka's debt stock and how it has grown.
First the man takes the drink, then the drink takes the drink, then the drink takes the man. Debt can work like that, right? First the country takes the debt, then the debt takes the debt, and then the debt begins to take the country.
The business community was complaining constantly about the high tax regime of the Yahapana government. Didn't the business community deserve some relief?
I wouldn't be surprised if the private sector companies today are willing to say openly that they're happy to accept a higher tax rate if the government runs a more sustainable, stable fiscal policy and monetary policy for the country.
The data from the central bank, can the people rely on it entirely?
When you get into the habit of misreporting to make things look good, there's a significant danger of getting your decision making also misinformed and misguided.
The central bank governor, Mr. Ajit Niwat Cabral, has said that certain people have been predicting Sri Lanka will default in 2020 and then in 2021 and now in 2022, but that the government has managed to defy all these predictions. Do you think he was referring to you and Verity Research as well?
Our fault in this case, unfortunately, is that we've been too optimistic.
Do the rating agencies have an agenda against Sri Lanka to destabilize the country?
It's very important to not invent a conspiracy theory when one doesn't like the messenger or the news.
What is the solution at the moment for Sri Lanka? Because it has ruled out restructuring, especially its ISP debt.
The governor himself in 2009, a month before joining an IMF program, said very publicly and on record that he would not enter into an IMF program.
Restructuring the debt, what does it do to our credibility?
You went into a restructure, then there's quite a large consequence because your ratings will come right down to restricted default, right? When you have a double C rating, your credibility is already gone.
Hello and welcome to the Morning Talks. I'm Charindra Chandrasena, the editor-in-chief of the morning newspaper. And today we have on the show Dr. Nishan de Mel, the executive director of Verity Research and renowned economist. Today we will talk to Dr. de Mel about Sri Lanka's economic situation, its debt stock, and also the government's economic policy. Dr. Nishan de Mel, welcome to the Morning Talks.
Thank you, Charindra. Glad to be here.
You have constantly criticized the corporate tax cuts the government introduced in late 2019. However, the business community was complaining constantly about the high tax regime of the Yahapana government. Didn't the business community deserve some relief, especially considering how resilient it has been through multiple crises?
Yeah, thank you, Charindra. What we were critical about was not the corporate tax cuts specifically, but the whole tax reform that took place. And principally, the criticism was around the lack of analysis behind the changes that happened. So I'll give you some examples. This change effectively took away the payee tax methodology. So it was not just the quantity of tax, but the method of taxation. That reduced the personal income taxpayers by 40% in the country. That's a huge contraction of the tax base. It reduced the VAT taxpayers by 70%. So, 1 year later, we saw the government announce a tax amnesty, hoping to increase the tax base. But actually, a year previously, the changes in tax policy contracted the tax base massively. So, really, it is the lack of analysis on the consequences. And effectively, it also meant that the government was losing revenue of 25%. And as you know, since we run a budget deficit, a loss of government revenue is just a promise of future taxation, right? Because the government has to find that money at some point. So there are real consequences to a tax cut. And it is important that the analysis is there about how this might promote investment, how this will affect the tax base, how this will affect government and the economy. And I think what Verity argues principally is that you shouldn't be taking momentous economic policy changes without an analysis of the consequences. And I think the missing analysis was really the problem. And it shows now that has had, fairly negative consequences on the country. And I think that is why we were worried about it. Yeah.
Right. But do you not think that it has helped in terms of, say, trickle-down economics theory, is that if you give tax breaks to the corporations, that it will trickle down in terms of investments and therefore job creation, and that stimulates the economy? Aren't you a subscriber to that belief?
Yeah. So I think, I always move from belief to analysis, right? Clearly, 100% corporate tax rate is not viable, and a 0% corporate tax rate is not viable.
Right.
So what is the optimal level of taxation is an analytical question. It's not a belief question. It's not 0, it's not 100. So is it 50%? Is it 40%? Is it 30? So you have to have an analysis of what you say is the marginal propensity to invest based on a tax cut. What are companies likely to do? So these are questions on which you need a lot of data and you need an analysis, and then you determine what the consequence is. So sometimes increasing taxes has a better outcome, sometimes decreasing has a better outcome. It depends on where you start off with. So Sri Lanka already had a reasonably lower tax rate on corporates compared to many developed countries. So it wasn't that Sri Lanka was obviously too high in its taxation. If at all, it looked like Sri Lanka was somewhat low. Now, that doesn't mean a tax cut may not have a successful impact, but it means that you must have analysis. Now, I'll tell you the impact that this tax cut had. So the proper point of comparison might be 2018, because 2019, you had the Easter tax and all kinds of disruptions. So if you compare 2020 with 2018, you found that, local investment after the tax cut actually reduced by 4% of GDP, from 30% to 26%. That's a 500 billion rupee reduction in investment after the tax cut in a year that didn't have any kind of, calamity like in 2019. Likewise, foreign direct investment reduced from 4% of GDP to 1% of GDP from 18 to 20. Because even international investors look at the health of the government. And they make decisions based on looking at the sustainability of the economy. And when a tax cut, effectively has the consequence of reducing the government's income by 25%, that's the analytical consequence of the tax cut. By the way, a lot of this data that I'm talking about is available on the platform called publicfinance.lk of Verite. And we publish the analysis. So I'm not just giving you numbers. I'm giving you numbers that you can actually look up on the research that we have published. So the 25% consequence, I think immediately can have a discouraging impact on investors, because they see the economy as moving into unsustainable territory in terms of the government fiscal side.
Right. Now, when somebody criticizes the economy at the moment, from the government side, what always comes out is, why are people thinking that is a normal situation? The whole world is in crisis, other countries are in crisis. Sri Lanka is just part of the global economy, and therefore we have no way of escaping this. Do you subscribe to that, in the sense that, is this a global issue with the pandemic, and therefore Sri Lanka couldn't possibly have been in a better position economically than it is now?
Yeah. So let me just do a quick follow-up to the previous question, also with regard to corporates and businesses, and come back to your question. Corporates and businesses need not only tax reductions, but other aspects of the economy to be healthy. So for instance, if your tax reductions lead to a consequence of government having too little money, needing to finance itself through expanding money supply that may have a consequence on inflation, then that inflation consequence may be worse than the tax cut. If the government is struggling to pay its debt, because effectively, as you know, the downgrading that we suffered, that shut us out of international financial markets happens, perhaps according to the rating agencies themselves, consequent to the tax cuts, evaluating the problems created for government through the tax cuts. Now, that consequence is far worse, arguably, for the private sector, than if they had maintained the taxes and prevented a downgrade. So I wouldn't be surprised if the private sector companies today are willing to say openly that they're happy to accept a higher tax rate if the government runs a more sustainable, stable fiscal policy and monetary policy for the country, because it is not only taxes that affect the business environment, it is the whole macroeconomic management that is impacted by the tax cuts. Right? Coming back to your other question about is this a global outcome, I think certainly external shocks are consequential to a country like Sri Lanka. And COVID-19 had a huge external impact. So there's no doubt that we will have a feedback from global consequences that are both positive and negative. Okay, for instance, the negative consequences are that for a period, of course, you couldn't move around. Trade became more expensive. It became harder to trade, etc. Positive consequences are there is an enormous decoupling from China. Movement away from single sourcing. So if the way to understand this question is to look at your region. I think others have presented this, that within the region, most people have managed to increase their reserves, foreign reserves, not decrease them like Sri Lanka has. Many countries have managed to increase their trade, especially in the Asia and East Asia, outside of China, right? So Sri Lanka really must not just simply think of a blanket global problem, but ask, why is it that we haven't been able to emulate the successes of the countries around us within this pandemic and manage it in the way that other countries have done more successfully?
Right. Now, you did a Verity research, did an analysis of Sri Lanka's debt stock and how it has grown. So, the analysis showed that the total debt stock increased by 42.8% during 2015 and 2019. That's the previous government, and at least 90%, at least 89.8% of that increase was due to the interest cost on accumulated past debt. Is there a way of showing which period that past debt? I mean, there are data obviously, but how much of that responsibility lies with the previous Rajapaksa government from 2005 to 15?
Yeah. So I think this kind of analysis isn't designed for a blame game. Okay. It is really designed for us to have a more mature understanding of our economic situation. And the analysis that you're talking about, how debt and interest on debt played out in the previous 5 years and the previous 5 years, this analysis is ongoing and we will publish it soon. Okay. I think this particular period is extraordinary because what we saw is that, almost, 90% of the increase in debt, which was still significant, was driven by interest. What it means is that Sri Lanka should worry not only about the amount of debt, but the cost of debt. So in 2007 and 8, Sri Lanka graduated from being a low-income country to a middle-income country. It also meant that we lost access to concessional financing the way we had it in the past. So much of the bilateral, multilateral funding that Sri Lanka had from the late 70s and 80s was concessional long-term funding at low interest rates. Now, when we switched from that, and the first ISBs are released in 2007-8, to funding ourselves through international sovereign bonds, this money can come at a higher interest cost. And actually, even the Exim Bank of China functions like a financial market player and lends at the same rate, at the high rates. Okay. So then the moment you are borrowing becomes more expensive and you have to factor in depreciation cost, which is the cost of borrowing. Then you have to worry about the returns to investment. Say if I'm borrowing at 6% and effectively my depreciation is 4-5% a year annually, and that I expect, then I have to have a return of more than 11-12% to justify that borrowing. So really what it does is it makes you a lot more concerned about whether I'm putting the money into the right kind of things, because if I don't do that and if I can't get a tax revenue, so even if you grow GDP with lots of tax holidays, this doesn't quite work out because the government is then not able to meet that cost of borrowing. So today, at least last year, the 71% of government revenue went on interest alone on outstanding debt. That is, brings you into answer. That, as far as I can see, is one of the highest ratios in the world for interest cost on government revenue. Now, I think those things should ring alarm bells for us, because when you get a ratio like that, that was Lebanon's ratio 2 years ago, and they had to go into default. And we know the state of Lebanon. I think these were early warnings that the economy is headed into crisis, and we have to get into a more professional management of our debt. And I think the 90% interest cost on the increase of debt actually was also, a sign that this is what is driving our debt now. There's this old saying in Japan that says, at the punch bowl's brink, let the thirsty man think what they say in Japan. First the man takes the drink, then the drink takes the drink, then the drink takes the man. Debt can work like that, right? First the country takes the debt, then the debt takes the debt, and then the debt begins to take the country. And you really have to avoid getting to that third stage. So when you see that the debt is taking the debt, that the interest on debt is driving new debt, that's the time to step back before you lose control of the situation.
Right. Now, you have claimed that expenditure in 2020 was relocated to 2019 by the central bank to make it appear that the budget deficit was 11% in 2020, when it was in fact 14%. Is this legal, and if so, is it ethical?
Yeah, so I think the question of legality comes out of asking, are we acting according to the accounting standards that exist in the country? So I think the Auditor General is quite clear on that. We violated the country's accounting standards, therefore it's inaccurate. So the moment the Auditor General says this is not correct, it is not correct. Now, I think the financial laws I don't think have a punishment mechanism for government violating reporting rules, but certainly it does highlight that this is not the right number, and I think it's better to be correctly informed than incorrectly informed. Poor information, poor understanding of the underlying reality can lead to poor decision making. And that's enormously consequential. I even take, this great famine of China, Mao Zedong. Historians and others who have analyzed that later on point that there was fundamentally an informational problem. That what happened was that, local units that were reporting production, because of some climate consequences in China, all over the country had lower production, but each one was afraid to report a lower production. They wanted to report something that make them look good. And so they reported a slightly inflated number. But when all of China reports slightly inflated number, at the center they thought they had the production to feed the nation, but it's a famine that kills dozens of millions of people and one of the greatest calamities in the country. So like that, when you get into the habit of misreporting to make things look good, there's a significant danger of getting your decision making also misinformed and misguided. And I think this is why we should be particularly concerned.
So does that mean that this is a habitual, is this a pattern where the central bank at the moment, the data from the central bank, can the people rely on it entirely?
So I think it was disappointing to see central bank also provide this same number in its annual report. It was the Ministry of Finance that misreported it. And the central bank in its annual report, even though its previous year's annual report had given the right number, revised its own previous year's annual report without any change in the circumstances, but sort of put a footnote to say we are just putting what the Ministry of Finance has put down and denied any ownership of that. So I think the central bank was aware it was incorrect. But I think the important thing is that we urge policymakers and the system to get a right understanding, to tell the truth. Because when you don't tell the truth to Parliament, to people, you just erode trust and confidence. And that has enormous consequences on the country, right? And I think the problem in misreporting happens more in the budget. And if you read Verité's, budget reports, what we show is that, Verité has systematically over the last 4 or 5 years predicted revenue and expenditure outcomes at the time of the budget more correctly than the budget documents have. So I think that's the problem. When a third party with limited access to data even can make better forecasts on outcomes than the government is putting down, it does mean that the government forecasts are not as well done and not attempting to get to the truth adequately. And that's, of course, a disservice. It's a disservice to our parliamentarians who have to make decisions. It's a disservice to the public who try to understand what's going on and are voting based on it. And it's ultimately a disservice to the economy because it leads to bad judgment, and bad judgment leads to bad outcomes.
Right. The central bank governor, Mr. Ajit Niwat Kabral, has said that certain people have been predicting Sri Lanka will default in 2020 and then in 2021 and now in 2022, but that the government has managed to defy all these predictions. Do you think he was referring to you and Verité Research as well?
So it's unlikely, though I don't know what's in his mind. I can't purport to know that. I think you have heard us on public events and you've seen our reports. We have our fault in this case, unfortunately, is that we've been too optimistic. Okay. In all of 2020, we said, look, government has enough money to pay debts in 2020 and 2021. And it's only in 2022 that the government is likely to run into problems. And even that, we had very specific forecasts that said government can meet its obligations until it gets close to the end of 2022. So we had forecasts for reserve declines for 2021, and we expected reserves to be close to 3 billion, 2.8 to be precise, on our base case. Our optimistic case was even better. Now, the actual reserves at the end of November, and there are some unusable reserves that are being counted, just like that budget problem. Okay. So if we take the usable reserves coming down to 1 month, that was actually our worst case scenario. So Verité's problem, I think, in terms of our clients and our briefings, is that what was realized was our worst case scenario, right? And our base case was much more optimistic, and our optimistic case was even more optimistic. So we've had to revise our cases now, downwards, not upwards.
Right.
I think the central bank governor may be referring to people who had to revise their predictions in a more positive direction. We had to actually revise our predictions in a more negative direction, because we didn't, we expected the government to take kind of more proactive steps earlier. To stem the outflow of reserves, and to also build confidence. We thought the budget end of 2021 will be a budget that tries to resolve the problem, but I think the loss of confidence then escalated on the consequences, and so it's very unfortunate. I'm sad about it, because we have always maintained that Sri Lanka knows how to step back from the brink. We don't always know how to avoid getting to the brink. The fact that we've been in 16 IMF programs tells you that we get to the brink and then we step back. We find a way forward. And, the governor of the central bank himself did that quite successfully in 2009. He stepped back from the brink with an IMF program, which was very successfully implemented, during which he had a rating upgrade as well. So really, we thought, look, we have the ability to repeat that experience. So I think what has transpired, which is quite different to the past, has been a surprise to us. And we are, it is not that we have been too pessimistic. It's really that we've been too optimistic.
Okay, but Nishan, now when an economist like you, who is held in high esteem, paints a bleak picture of the country's economy, doesn't it drive away foreign investors and alarm foreign governments? Is it not then a self-fulfilling prophecy?
Yeah. So I think that this problem of self-fulfilling prophecy exists in economics, right? That expectations can drive outcomes. In 2020, I told you foreign direct investment fell from 4 billion in 2018 to 1 billion. So I think this problem of people exiting Sri Lanka or worrying about Sri Lanka really sets in with the credit rating downgrade that Sri Lanka suffers in middle 2020 post the tax cuts. Right, and losing access to financial markets and then not taking steps to solve the problem adequately. I don't think that, speaking the truth and providing numbers that are accurate should be a reason to think about people becoming more pessimistic than they ought to be. People value credible, realistic estimates, and it is when you lose trust and credibility and lose the ability to gain a right picture of economy that people put a very high risk premium on you and then don't want to invest or want a lot more returns for their investment. So I think all of our collective tasks, and I mean by that the media as well, is to become as accurate and truthful as we possibly can. We are all limited in how we can do that, because that enables some space of credibility that then gives people more confidence. But if people believe that everything is public relations, everything is set up to mislead you or to paint a too optimistic picture, they'll start discounting the value of what you say. And when they do that, there is no bottom. Right? You can't really establish the truth even when it is the truth anymore. So I think the value of independent commentators, independent media organizations is that we become a baseline of trust. And thereby actually prevent confidence from sinking too low. Because I don't think people easily have confidence in the government, and the more the government misreports numbers, misrepresents, the more the confidence goes away, and the more they look for alternative sources of trust and the track record of those. So provided we haven't been overly pessimistic, which we haven't. So I would say people would fault us still for being overly optimistic and having them make too optimistic decisions. That's also bad, because then later we can't even come and say, no, it is all right. They'll say, you said that earlier. Right? So it's important to be as credible and as close to the truth as you can. Yeah.
No, when this, because you mentioned rating agencies, when the downgrades happen from the big three rating agencies, the central bank always responds with, this was done in too much of a hurry. They haven't taken into account all the facts. This is inaccurate. This is based on little knowledge or something to that effect. Is there an agenda of, do the rating agencies have an agenda against Sri Lanka to destabilize the country?
So I think it's very important to not invent a conspiracy theory when one doesn't like the messenger or the news, right? It would be highly unlikely, in my view, that global rating agencies are somehow independent and in competition with each other, are acting in concert to target a tiny little country like Sri Lanka. Right? I could understand if there's a major struggle between superpowers and one country claimed rating agencies are based in other countries and are being unfair to them. Plus, they publish documents that provide analytical basis for how they evaluate a country. These documents have the same structures and templates as they do for every other country. They also provide the data and the facts that they use. So I think if one disagrees with the rating, and I don't mean to say that somehow rating agencies have some ability to get a perfect understanding of things. It's possible that they make mistakes. But then one should be able to demonstrate that analytically by showing, look, they didn't follow the same template as they did for an equivalent country, or this particular piece of information that they took was actually based on a wrong data point. So I think if you can't do that, it's important not to simply dismiss it then, but to study the reports. And take them seriously. This is a case in which the first umpire, second umpire, third umpire, everybody is coming to the same verdict. And I think then it is the burden of, proof lies in those who disagree, I think, to demonstrate why this is wrong. And I think, unfortunately, this approach hasn't helped Sri Lanka either, because international investors and markets will look at whether Sri Lanka can be trusted. And I think without analysis, if you reject your rating, assessments, that doesn't help build trust, I feel.
Right. Now going to the foreign exchange, the exchange rate, the rupee being fixed at 203, to the dollar has deprived Sri Lanka of foreign exchange earnings, most notably with worker remittances. If the solution is to float the rupee, where do you think it would end up, and would that solve some of these problems?
So I think we have to get behind the rate that you fix as to why is the rupee or the dollar in short supply. The problem to fix is the shortage of dollars. So the price on the dollar to rupee that you see in the unofficial market is the price that is based on demand and supply. And this is not there are two things that have happened, right, in this situation to drive up what's the unofficial price. One is that the supply has got constricted enormously. Why? Because we are paying international debt and we are not able to refinance it in the same way. That's why your reserves keep coming down. Okay. So the equilibrium of, dollar inflows and outflows is lost. Government is on the buy side, not on the sell side. So they've effectively, taken away supply. So government has taken the dollars that are coming in through exporters and others, put it in the pocket of the central bank, and they forced conversions at some levels, and then taken it out of the system to pay bondholders without being able to replenish those dollars with new borrowings. So this particular strategy or path has created enormous shortage on one side. But as you create this shortage, you create expectations. What you said about that Sri Lanka is going to run into such a big shortage that at some point you have to let the dollar be traded at a much higher rate. Now, when that happens, people try to buy the dollars in advance. So you could also potentially have an increasing demand because people are worried that the future is not good. So if you think that, petrol prices will go up tomorrow, you realize there are queues trying to buy petrol tonight, right? So you can have an increasing demand on anticipation. So, the shortage has given rise to both these problems. It has driven up the price by lack of supply. It could have also driven up by the price of by increasing demand, fearing a problem. So, yes, providing a higher rate for the dollar is one way to solve it. But honestly, I think that should be part of a toolkit of solutions, not a single solution. Because if you don't solve the shortage problem, you keep driving up this problem of the depreciation, right? So really, you should not start by talking about depreciation. You should start by talking about the shortage. How do you reverse the negative expectations? How do you increase the supply of dollars? And the ways to do that we can talk about. And then as you stem the shortage, the pressure on depreciation also reduces. But then depreciation can be part of a toolkit of getting stability.
Right. Now, this central bank, the central bank's sale of its gold holdings recently came in for a lot of criticism. But in a press release, the central bank said that the share of gold holdings in the reserve may change from time to time to serve the reserve management needs of the CBSL, and that the gold holdings could be replenished in the future. Do you agree with that policy?
So I agree with the statement.
Okay.
Yeah, clearly the portfolio mix that you maintain your reserves in should be based on optimizing the returns to your reserves. So maybe if I hold it in dollars, I get a high interest rate in dollars. If I hold it in gold and gold is appreciating price, then my effective return is higher and gold can be converted to dollars as well. Okay. So really the judgment must be made on optimizing the return to your reserve portfolio. Now, the fact that it is true doesn't mean that this particular action was based on an optimization decision. Because I think the suspicion or worry that you have seen amongst commentators, we haven't commented on the issue, is that the gold reserves were sold simply to get liquidity and because you were cash strapped. Now, the moment you have to do something because you're cash strapped and liquidity constrained, rather than because you're optimizing your returns, then it's a suboptimal outcome. So the real question is, was this the optimal time to sell your gold? Right? That means we expect gold prices to have peaked in some way, or returns to, say, dollar reserves increasing in a way that it is much more advantageous to switch your portfolio from gold to cash. And now I don't know whether there is an assessment on that, but all I'm saying is the fact that it is possible doesn't mean necessarily that this particular decision followed an optimizing principle.
So it could have been
but I would say, we don't want to criticize it simply because at this stage we are not able to make that estimation. Okay.
Right. Okay. Now the government appears to be hopeful that the earnings from the sale of state-owned land to foreign investors could rescue Sri Lanka from the current situation. And dozens of lands have already been earmarked for lease. Would land in Sri Lanka be attractive to foreign investors if the economy is in crisis?
So, unlike on the gold question of portfolio switch, here I would have a more critical view of the sale of assets in the country. That is simply for this reason, that I think if you are selling assets in the country, and I'm not, principally against or for selling assets, so I'm neutral on that question.
Okay.
I think you have to optimize your returns. I mean, this is ultimately about optimizing benefits to the country. To optimize returns, you have to evaluate your assets, you have to do proper valuations, you have to engage in a process of competitive bidding, you have to structure them in a way that is optimal for sale and value realization, both short term and long term. Now, I think it is fair to say that there doesn't appear to be that process in place. I mean, if there is no competitive bidding, this is a guaranteed way of losing value. I mean, we have done lots of assessments on mega infrastructure projects. Subhashini Abesinghe, research director at Verite, I mean, we publish stuff also. What we see is without competitive bidding, Sri Lanka loses value, right? So whenever assets are sold without competitive bidding systems and valuation systems and structuring systems, which take time, fire sales are never a good way to benefit the economy as a whole. Right. So I think, and also as you're saying, when you're doing a fire sale because the country is in crisis, so people have already given very high risk premiums to the country. You can see that on the secondary market trading in our bonds. So when you have as a country a high risk premium, international investment will look for higher returns. That means lower costs to enter the market. And that's not an advantageous time, as you're saying, right? To engage in a sale. You want to engage in a sale when confidence is high and the risk premiums are low, because then you get a higher price for the same return that they expect.
Right. Yeah. Nishan, what is the solution at the moment for Sri Lanka? Because it has ruled out restructuring especially its ISB debt. What is the solution in that case?
Yeah. So I think, this question of ruling out the sale of ISB debt, we mustn't take it as a given. Okay. Because I think the governor himself in 2009, a month before joining an IMF program, said very publicly and on record that he would not enter into an IMF program, and changed his mind when he probably was already in negotiation with the IMF at that time, because the program came soon after, right? So I think let's not assume that the government has a fixed position. It may have a rhetorical position, but in reality, the job of the government is to do what is best for the country. What is best for the country at this time is to share the pain that the country is feeling with as wide a base as possible. So that we know that there is pain, because the shortage of dollars is causing pain, and that is caused by paying the creditors on time and in full. Okay, that's leading to inflation that's causing pain. It's leading to fire sales that's causing pain, because it's taking away future money, future benefits for the country. So we are causing pain not only to today's economy, but the future economy as well, but all to the local economy. So I think the basic guidance that is available internationally and everywhere else is, creditors lend by taking a risk. That's why they charge Sri Lanka much higher interest rate than they charge the United States, right? So when we lend at 6, 7, 8%, or borrow, United States borrows at 1% or 2% or less. So that higher risk premium that we paid was for them to take some risk. And when the risk materializes, they should face some consequences. That is the law of the economy or the market. Now, you can't rescue the rich from the consequences of the risks they have taken to make money. That's inappropriate in any system. Okay. So we mustn't be overly keen to rescue creditors from the consequences of the risk they took. We can share the risk with the creditors. And, countries do this all the time. And creditors, we know that is how the global financial system works. So I think sharing the pain is the way out. There is now difficult to avoid pain at this stage, because we can see that that's unsustainable. But I think it's it's unjust to front load and convert that pain into a pain that is felt by the Sri Lankan people and Sri Lankan economy. And it's not even worthwhile, because all it means is that the economy gets into greater trouble and the problem snowballs.
But Nishan, restructuring the debt, what does it do to our credibility? Right? Will we have investors after that? Will they say, no, these guys wanted to restructure in 2022, why should we invest in them again?
It's a really good question, because if you had an investment grade rating and you went into a restructure, then there's quite a large consequence, because your ratings will come right down to restricted default, right? When you have a double C rating, your credibility is already gone. Actually, it went 1 year ago or 2 years ago. In 2020, we lost credit. When you lose access to financial markets, people talk about getting blacklisted and all that. Well, that's already happened, right? Because when people say we will not lend to you, you have cut off access from financial markets unless you want to pay 20-30% or whatever. I mean, the secondary market returns yields tell you the rates at which people will lend to you, which means you're already blacklisted. You already lost credibility. So really, the markets are saying, look, we already expect you to restructure. So there is not, your ratings will fall again, because that's the system. But it's the best part to recover your ratings. There are many examples: Ukraine, Ecuador, Argentina, all in the last few years. I use Ecuador as a particularly easy example to understand, because, and it's not just Ecuador, okay? But within 6 months, when they went to CCC, they actually negotiated their debt. And within 6 months got back to B- after restructure. So restructure is really the best path to regaining credibility, because as long as you continue to lose your reserves, there's no path to credibility. And as long as your reserves look unstable based on short-term swaps, etc., the country looks in perpetual crisis, you're not going to recover ratings. So for instance, when the central bank governor put out his roadmap, right, his improving credit ratings was a key indicator that he put forward. That's going to happen. Getting reserves back to 4 months was a key indicator. What's happening is that reserves are going down and credit ratings are going down. Okay, so stability of inflation was a key indicator in the mid-single digits, and stability of interest rates. All these indicators are being lost because the country is moving into crisis. Right. So if to recover that stability, to recover stability of interest rates, inflation, to recover your reserves, because that you'll do that when you stop having large outflows and you restructure, and thereby with a negotiated restructure, it has to be a negotiation upon agreement to increase credit ratings, is the best and most feasible path for Sri Lanka at this time.
The drop in credit ratings, is it also a problem of a lack of engagement with the rating agencies, or an unhealthy relationship?
I think we don't need to have that assumption, because the fundamentals already indicate that the rating downgrade is justified, and you can see that, right? You can see that as reserves come down, the rating agencies look at your future ability to pay, not your past record per se. Past record matters as a slight indicator, but really the driving force is future ability. And as the future ability to pay looks more and more uncertain, ratings are going to come down. So I think the governor had the right goals: increase the credit rating, increase the reserves. But the current strategic path is not going to get you there.
Right.
And that's what Sri Lanka needs to understand and fix.
Right. Dr. Nishan de Mel, thank you very much for appearing on the Morning Talks.
Thank you, Charinder. All the best to you.